We'll now move on to the second presenter, Jacob Weber from the New York Fed, who will talk about firm wage setting and on-the-job search limit wage price spirals.
All right, thank you for that introduction and for putting this paper on the program. This is joint work with Seung at Oxford and Justin at Cornell. And in this paper, we're going to argue that in economies where firms have the power to set wages and where workers search on the job, that there's going to be a limited scope for wage price spirals to occur. Now, what do I mean when I say wage price spirals? So the motivation for this paper lies in the well-known fact that both price inflation and wage inflation surged during COVID. And this led policymakers to sort of naturally wonder whether or not price inflation might somehow be causing the unusual amount of wage inflation that we saw, or whether that wage inflation simply reflected tight labor markets that also occurred at this time. And so that first channel kind of reflects concerns about the following propagation mechanism, which sometimes comes up in discussions about, the 1970s inflation that occurred in the United States. Specifically, the concern is that a shock to one sector of the economy will raise wages for workers in the broader, raise costs for workers in the broader set of the economy, causing workers to increase their wage demands to reclaim their purchasing power. Now that will lead to firms having higher marginal costs in the broader economy. That will then lead to a generalized inflation in a process which will, in principle, repeat. So it's this amplification channel that I'm kind of talking about here when I'm talking about wage price spirals. That's what the title of the paper refers to. So we might be particularly interested in whether or not this channel, kind of exists in the real world or is quantitatively relevant, given the fact that conventional sticky wage macro models that we use to study the transmission of inflationary shocks generally assume that this channel of amplification exists, either because they assume counterfactually that unions set wages in the United States, so only about 1 in 10 workers is unionized in the United States at present, or because they assume some ad hoc real wage rigidity, which will just mechanically cause nominal wages to rise whenever prices rise. So of course, the union wage setting assumption is used in the literature because it's tractable. So this is their Chegg, Henderson, Levine kind of setting. And so we're going to depart from this literature and write down a model that's inspired by microevidence that suggests wage posting is perhaps the dominant form of kind of wage determination that workers face in U.S. labor markets. But we're going to try to stay equally tractable, kind of in reflection of the fact that the union wage setting assumption is popular, not because of its realism, but because it's convenient. So we're going to try to write down a kind of similarly convenient and tractable model where firms have the power to post wages and embed that in the kind of DSGE models that people use to study these inflationary shocks. And in that setting, we're then going to ask, when firms set wages, how should we expect those wages to respond to what I'm going to call a cost of living shock that raises the price of workers' consumption bundle without affecting their marginal product of labor, right? So where I'm going here is a kind of a simple two-sector economy where we're going to have a services sector where firms have the power to set prices and wages, and we're going to ask how the wages in that sector respond to an increase in workers' consumption bundle that's just going to come from a shock to the price of this endowment good that workers consume in addition to the services good. So that's sort of where we're going. So visually, here's a plot that I'm sure a lot of us in this room are very familiar with. This is just a plot of US CPI inflation, that's the red line, against US nominal wage growth, that's the blue line. And of course, what I want you to notice here is that while these things were very tightly correlated, kind of during COVID, they surged together and then later kind of came down together. They're not generally that correlated in practice, right? So that kind of leads to a natural question. If CPI inflation isn't like generally correlated with wage growth, what is? So we're going to focus in this paper on the fact that the quits rate is in practice tightly correlated with wage growth. Now, this is the quits rate from JOLTS, which includes mainly like job-to-job transitions, but also quits to unemployment. And so this fact just reflects sort of a well-known fact in the kind of macro labor literature that job-to-job transitions in practice really seem to predict wage growth. And we're just extending that through the COVID pandemic. And something I want you to note here that really sort of inspired this project, for me at least, is that viewed from this kind of angle, there's nothing unusual about the COVID era wage growth, right? Like, at least, the only thing that was unusual was that labor markets seem to have also been unusually tight. All right, so that's going to lead us to not only write down a model with firms posting wages, but also where workers search on the job so that we can have some quits and have some hope of capturing that tight wage Phillips curve relationship, right, between nominal wage inflation and labor market tightness in the data. So my attempt to talk about the model on one slide, two key features. First, that firms are going to have the power to post wages, but also they're going to do so in a frictional labor market, which is going to mean that the firm's wage that they choose is going to be trading off like labor costs versus turnover costs. So the intuition here that's going to be present in the model is that our firms are going to be thinking to themselves, well, if I pay a higher wage, that's costly. I have to pay my workers more, but it's also going to be a good thing because it means those workers are going to be less likely to quit, to join other firms or, to quit into unemployment. And that means I can conserve on my costly vacancy posting costs, okay? So that's the trade-off that the firms are going to face in this model. Which means that in our setting, the question then becomes, does an increase in the cost of living sort of all else equal, which is what our sort of shock is designed to think about. It's, kind of our best, shot at kind of considering that thought experiment in a general equilibrium setting. When the price level goes up, does it make workers harder to recruit or retain? In a benchmark model, the answer is going to be no. And so, of course, we're going to get no pass through. But you might think, maybe that's intuitive to you, it was intuitive to us, but you might also think, well, maybe it's possible that, when the price level goes up, if I think back to like my neoclassical model of labor supply, a decrease in the real wage will make workers prefer to consume more leisure. So, it's also possible that maybe an increase in the price level, if that's your model of like the benefits from unemployment, makes unemployment more attractive. But even in that setting, the fact that we're going to have workers searching on the job means that quantitatively we're going to get very little pass through from making unemployment more attractive. Why? It's because firms are going to be correctly understanding that they're competing with each other for workers and not really so much with the unemployment state. But of course, in the benchmark model, where an increase in the price level doesn't make workers harder to recruit or retain, there's going to be no pass through, right? An increase in the price level basically doesn't improve workers' bargaining position, so there's no reason for firms to raise wages. So I'm going to now we'll walk through the model and sort of bring you that intuition step by step. All right, so here's this two-sector setup that I promised you kind of on the first slide. We're going to have a consumption good that's composed of two parts. There's a services good where firms are going to be producing the services Y with labor. That's where all the action is going to be in the model. And we're also going to have this sort of second good, which is an endowment good that I'm going to call my cost of living shock. So this is basically, you can think of this as maybe like unprepared food, but really it's sort of the like fruit that falls off of a Lucas tree. All households are going to be endowed with the same amount. So there's some like no trade price that we can back out that's going to rise when we shock the quantity of that endowment good. And that's going to allow us to basically think through the thought experiment of what happens to an increase with an increase in the price level, kind of leaving the productivity of workers in the Y sector unchanged, right? So we're just making their consumption bundle more expensive and asking what happens to wages. So that's going to depend on what firms choose for wages, because this is not a union wage setting model, right? Firms are going to have power post wages here. They're going to have they're also going to have price setting power, right? Coming from downward sloping CES demand of the standard form, and then wage setting power that's going to come from the fact that workers have idiosyncratic preferences over different workplaces, as well as the unemployment state. So that's something we're borrowing from the monopsony literature, and that's where sort of the novelty is going to be in this setting. So we're going to walk through workers' problem first, because that's going to tell us how firms view the sort of like wage retention trade-off. So workers first are going to inhabit households. I'm going to go through this part pretty quickly because not only is it standard, but it's sort of reverse engineered to give us a very standard like aggregate demand block in the model. How are we going to do that? So we're going to assume a representative household maximizes the consumption of its individual members. That's going to include both unemployed workers who get that consumption CUT and employed workers who are going to get consumption based on the wage that they receive, at the firm that they work for. Where in the model, we're basically going to assume that firms just set one wage for all workers within the firm. So that wage is going to be indexed by the firm J that I works at. So that choice for unemployment benefits is going to have to satisfy both a standard budget constraint, where the unemployment benefit will be funded by taxes on employed workers, while also satisfying this consumption sharing rule. So this is not a substantive assumption for the kind of question we're interested in this paper. I'm going to motivate it very briefly here, just in addition to tractability with two other things. The first is that it's sort of, you can think of this as a fairness constraint. So what this is saying is that on average, employed workers have to be receiving more consumption than unemployed workers. And then second, it's actually kind of empirically convenient given the fact that we observe that on average in practice, the ratio of consumption of unemployed to employed workers is relatively constant over the business cycle. So it's not a crazy empirical assumption. Again, it's not substantive. We will relax it, later on in the talk. But sort of what's important here is that basically the value of unemployment in this setup is just going to be a paycheck. It's not going to be coming from leisure, right? Finally, because the household trades a bond in zero net supply in their budget constraint, that gives us a standard Euler equation that you're all familiar with at the bottom of the slide here with log utility. All this to say the aggregate demand block of this model is completely bog standard. It's not where the novelty is. That's in the workers problem who inhabits these households. So workers basically face a discrete choice problem. They're only ever going to be choosing between, taking a job at one workplace or another, or between working and unemployment. And that's going to be occurring in a frictional labor market that is also going to be kind of pretty standard. So at the beginning of the period, each firm J is going to post their wage, which is going to apply to all workers within the firm, and some vacancies, VJT. There's some exogenous separations. That's not terribly important. You can ignore that if you like, but there are exogenous separations in the model. And then finally, we're going to determine total searchers, which is going to include both all of the unemployed workers and a share lambda EE of the employed workers. That's where on-the-job search comes into this model. We're going to assume that that fraction is constant and calibrated to recent US data. You can endogenize that with respect to inflation. It doesn't change our results too much. I won't have time to go into that extension today. So we're going to be working with this constant assumption. Matches happen, and workers are going to choose to then accept their offers or quit, where those matches are going to be determined by a totally standard, like constant returns to scale matching function. For those of you who aren't familiar with matching models, I mean, you're very much the audience for this paper. This is sort of trying to bring like on-the-job search very tractably into the sort of conventional representative agent macro models that we use often to think about, inflation or the propagation of shocks. So what's going on here? There's this constant returns to scale matching function M that is going to be determining how many matches get produced given the level of labor market tightness. So the key variable in all these search models is often represented by theta. Theta is the total number of vacancies or job openings divided by the total number of people searching for those openings. And if you're familiar with a DMP setup, the only difference here is that instead of V over U, we have V over S because some of our searchers are employed, right? And then, of course, that gives us two objects. One is the probability that a searching worker meets a firm's vacancy. That's going to be increasing in tightness, right? A lot of jobs chasing a few workers. That's good for workers. So F theta is increasing in theta. And then, of course, from the firm's perspective, high theta is sort of a bad thing. It means there's a lot of competition for workers, and that means that the probability that my vacancy meets a worker is decreasing in theta. Okay, so this is sort of standard matching setup with on-the-job search, where finally, we're also going to assume that employed workers can consider quitting into unemployment with some probability lambda EU that we also calibrate to US data, kind of to match the fact that in practice, workers don't quit into unemployment that often. All right, so that's the frictional setup. So how should we think about workers' discrete choice problem? Basically, workers, whenever they're choosing between two job offers or between a job offer and unemployment, they're just going to choose the option that maximizes their utility. It turns out that assuming workers are forward-looking doesn't change the results like quantitatively very much at all. So our benchmark case in the paper is this myopic assumption, which is great, largely not so much because it makes the math easier, but because we don't have to deal with the like dynamic timing consistency of wage setting in the firm's problem. So trust me when I say this is not too substantive. We have a whole appendix where we relax the myopia assumption. But for the benchmark case today, I'm gonna talk through the myopic assumption, which is great because it just means that the workers' problem is very simple. I just choose whichever workplace offers me the most consumption, subject to this idiosyncratic matching taste shock, which we're going to assume to take this type 1 extreme value formulation just to give us really nice closed form results for the workers' basically like job taking decision. So, okay, I'm choosing the job or between the job and unemployment that like maximizes my utility. What do those closed form expressions look like? So there's sort of 4 cases that the firm is going to be really interested in. This looks like a very ambitious slide. I promise you it's not. It's actually quite repetitive. So why are these the 4 objects that the firm is going to care about? Basically, when the firm is thinking about its like vacancy posting and wage setting decision, and it's trading off, between wage setting and recruiting rates, it's thinking about, all right, how does the wage that I set affect the ability that I recruit workers for my vacancies and also prevent workers from leaving, either quitting to other firms or to unemployment? So there's sort of 4 cases here. Let's work through the 2 recruiting rates first at the top of the slide here. So the first, whenever my vacancy meets a worker, there's 2 options. Either they work at some other firms. That's a job to job, potential job to job transition, or they're from unemployment. So in the first case, the probability that I successfully like poach a worker from another firm is just going to be intuitively increasing in the wage. That's the first thing I want you to notice here. But also, it's not the elasticity of the recruiting rate with respect to the wage is not infinite, right? So this is important because basically, for those of you who are familiar with the Burdett-Mortensen model, this is why ultimately what we're going to be able to have here is one wage in equilibrium, which is going to give us like a very tractable wage Phillips curve. The reason for that is that, if you'll notice here, even if two firms are setting the same wage, there's still some 50-50 chance that I successfully recruit a worker from the other firm, right? It just depends on whether or not they happen to have a high idiosyncratic preference for my workplace. The second thing I want you to notice here is that the price level is going to drop out of these job-taking decisions. Intuitively, that's because if I'm trying to choose between like a paycheck at Starbucks and a paycheck at Walmart, right? Then the price of eggs is totally irrelevant for that decision, right? Basically, a higher price of eggs or higher price of the grocery store is going to erode my real wage equally at both jobs, and it doesn't really affect my job-taking decision. Now, that's going to be completely true under log utility. Obviously, with like CRR utility, the price level wouldn't perfectly cancel out here. But in practice, quantitatively, even in a world where income and substitution effects don't cancel for like realistic values of like theta and a CRA utility function, you're not going to quantitatively get much pass through from relaxing the log assumption. So again, we're working with log here, and that because it really makes stark that intuition that the increase in the price level is like not that relevant when you're choosing between two nominal wage offers. That same logic is going to show up in my ability to recruit from unemployment. So you remember when I said that consumption sharing rule was not substantive for our results here? That's because what really matters here is that the value from unemployment here is a paycheck. So again, the price level is going to cancel out here. A high price level erodes the value of kind of unemployment, that paycheck, and the paycheck that I get by working equally. So those are the recruiting and separation rates. The two recruiting probabilities that are going to determine the firm's like recruiting rate. Similarly, there's separation probabilities where the logic goes the other way. If I pay a higher wage, that makes it less likely that my workers are going to separate to other firms and less likely that they're going to separate to unemployment. So finally, the top two things are going to aggregate up to the recruiting rate that the firm faces. This is going to depend, it's going to be increasing in the wage WJ that firm J offers. It's also going to depend on labor market tightness, which we suppress because the firm is going to take that as given, but critically, it doesn't depend on the price level. The same thing is true of the separation rate, except that's going to be decreasing in the wage, right? Kind of by the same logic, where that also depends on theta, but critically will not depend on the price level. So how do these two objects enter into the firm's decision? So that's sort of the last model slide I'm going to have for you, where again, like a lot of this is standard, with the exception of this law of motion for employment. So we got a firm here that's choosing both prices and wages, facing downward sloping demand for its product, but also where kind of critically there's a frictional labor market where you don't get to choose the stock of workers. Instead, you choose N by choosing the number of costly vacancies that you post. So let's kind of think through just kind of briefly here the firm's wage setting problem. So where does the wage enter? The wage obviously enters in front of the stock of workers. You have to pay your workers a wage, and we assume in the model that there's just one wage within the firm. So a higher wage means you have to pay all of your workers more. Why is that a good thing? Well, if I want more workers, I have to post costly vacancies. And so that's parameterized by that. That's just C. That's a constant times a potentially, like convex function. So it's not like C is not a general function. It's linear and potentially convex. You can set chi to 0 if you want and have this be a linear function. That's not too important for the qualitative results, but we argue that kind of like quantitatively, it's more interesting to have that convex. The point is that vacancies are costly, right? That gives you some incentive to raise the wage. Why? Because when you look at the law of motion for employment at the bottom here, right? It's going to say that the workers I have tomorrow are equal to the workers today, less separations, right? And plus the people that I recruit for my vacancies. Now, following the logic on the previous slide, if I raise the wage, the separation rate will fall, the recruiting rate will rise, and I won't have to post as many vacancies. So that's the trade-off that the firm is facing, right, when they think about paying a higher wage. This is sort of like an efficiency wage view of what's going on in this labor market, if you will. So because the price level doesn't affect those recruiting and separation rates, it's not going to affect the firm's wage setting decision, and we won't get pass-through from inflation to wages in this model. So we can close the model with a monetary rule and solve for a symmetric equilibrium. And we wind up with basically like a simple kind of representative agent model with one wage, in which we have very, very clean expressions for the wage Phillips curve that are similar to sort of reduced form regressions that people tend and policymakers tend to run in the data. So what do these wage Phillips curves look like? So to first order, we're going to get a relationship between nominal wage inflation and labor market tightness, that V over S thing, to first order, where what this reflects is the logic of the firm's first order conditions. Okay, because wages and vacancies are sort of basically two different tools I can use to recruit and retain workers. If I'm raising wages, it better be the case that I'm raising vacancies, and that gives me a strong relationship between theta and wage inflation on the right-hand side. There is also a secondary effect that comes from the composition of searchers in this model, right? So if there's a high unemployment rate, that means that the composition of S is tilted towards workers whose job taking decision is not very sensitive to the wage, right? When we calibrate this model to US data to try to capture the fact that workers who are unemployed basically always take wage offers, what that means is that kind of all else equal, like tightness, holding tightness fixed, having a pool of workers that's kind of relatively insensitive in their pool of searchers that's relatively insensitive in their job taking decision to the wage means that I prefer to try to recruit workers with vacancies rather than wages. So even holding tightness fixed, there's a small effects, quantitatively small effects in this model coming from an increase in the unemployment rate that makes firms shift from wanting to use wages to recruit workers to posting vacancies. So just as a final note here, so we're going to find that that beta theta is large and positive in our calibrated model. That beta u is going to be pretty small. And then finally, we can use a relationship in general equilibrium between quits and tightness to kind of swap out theta for quits and allow the model to capture that tight relationship I showed you earlier in US data between the quits rate and wage growth in a very tractable way. So again, where this kind of differs from like job ladder models of on-the-job search is that we have one wage in equilibrium, very tractable wage Phillips curves. You can embed this in any sort of medium-scale DSG model you like and still solve it without having to deal with the presence of an endogenous wage distribution. So that's kind of nice. And what do we gain from these tractable kind of wage Phillips curves? Well, you can already almost see our result without having to solve anything quantitatively, which is that there's no separate role for price inflation here, right? Just like in the data, the quits rate tracks wage inflation, and the only way that price inflation will matter, so there's no like expected price inflation here on the right-hand side either, will matter for wages is through its effects on firms' vacancy posting decisions and through labor market tightness, right? So in our thought experiment, if the monetary authority stabilizes the labor market, there's no pass-through from prices to wages. There's no extra wage inflation coming from price inflation, at least in the benchmark case of this model. So just to show you that, we're going to consider a big shock to X that raises the aggregate price level. And I'll just show you that in the model, quantitatively, you can already see the logic from those wage Phillips curves. When I hold those gaps on the right-hand side fixed with monetary policy, there's going to be no inflation, extra inflation coming from this shock in the model. So here's a negative shock to the endowment quantity that raises headline inflation in that bottom panel here. Because we haven't made workers harder to recruit or retain, the firm's problem for wage setting hasn't been affected. There's no change in vacancy posting or tightness. There's no change in wage growth, no change in firm marginal costs, and so no services inflation. As a result, workers in the services sector just see a decline in their real wage. Okay. I want to stop here and emphasize a few things. So first of all, that doesn't mean that the model can't explain why in practice there might be a correlation between wage growth and price inflation. You can get that in the model with demand shocks, right? Like monetary policy shocks. But the point of the model is what the model says is that that's going to work through an increase in labor market tightness, which is indeed like what we saw during COVID. Finally, I made a lot of simplifying assumptions here that people tend not to like, which is why we have to relax them and show that they don't matter. We do this in the appendix, just run through a few of the most important ones. You can endogenize lambda E to the price level. That's very important. You get a little bit of pass through there, but not that much. You can make workers forward looking and you can relax the log utility assumption. None of these things are going to quantitatively change the result that much. So very briefly, because I believe I'm running out of time, we can alter the model if you want. So this is sort of a really cheap way of just sort of modeling unemployment as maybe increasing in the value of the price level. So this is a model where really easy way to do this is just to assume unemployment benefits are inflation indexed. So that's maybe not that realistic, but it ends up being just like a little bit more tractable than assuming that the value of unemployment is leisure. But the end result here is that what we're going to find is that when in this setting the price level goes up, unemployment gets more attractive. That's going to mean that now there's this catch-up term where price inflation or prices matter on the right-hand side of the wage Phillips curve. So now if you close that quits rate and that unemployment rate, if you stabilize labor market, there will be some pass-through from price inflation to wage inflation. But quantitatively, that coefficient is small. Why? Because of the presence of on-the-job search. If you get rid of on-the-job search in this model, the amount of pass-through that you get increases by an order of magnitude. That's because we've made the wage relatively insensitive to changes in the value of unemployment benefits, which is good. That allows us to match empirical evidence that changes in unemployment benefits don't matter for the wage much. And that's also going to shut down this channel for the amplification of inflationary shocks to wages. So I am totally out of time here. I think I just want to highlight at the end here that this is consistent with the idea that so we developed a tractable new Keynesian model with wage posting. So again, like other people have studied this. The benefit here, I think, is really the tractability of this setting, where wage growth is driven mostly by quits. Again, that's a fact that other people have shown, although I want to highlight some recent research with some of my colleagues at the Fed showing that this also has good out-of-sample forecasting properties, kind of consistent with the model's highlighting of quits as the primary driver of wage growth. And with that, I'm just going to end. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Jacob. And we'll have Renato Faccini from the Danmarks Nationalbank discuss the paper.
So thanks a lot to the organizer for giving me the chance to discuss such interesting work that Jake has done with his co-authors. I've learned a lot in reading, studying the paper. This is a paper that asks a very timely and fundamental questions for everyone who is interested in inflation. So when the cost of living rises, do nominal wages adjust upwards? In the model, there is no pass-through from prices to wages. And this is the result of two combined assumptions: on-the-job search and wage posting, which is effectively means no bargaining power. My take on these two assumptions is there's certainly a lot of support for on-the-job search, the role it plays in wage inflation. Wage posting is also very interesting. It is plausible, at the same time, perhaps not universal. So I would perhaps warn against drawing bigger conclusion on the fact that wage price spiral cannot exist. They can still happen through other mechanisms, which I will explore and actually show that they may give rise to such spirals. So first assumption, so why on the job search? Because quits, they correlate with wage inflation extremely well and better than unemployment. Now, this should not be surprising. 50% of people hired have a job. 25% are recalls, people coming back from maternity or paternity. Only 25% come from unemployment, okay? So if we want to understand the wage inflation, we need to understand how wages are bargained by people who already have a job, and I buy that. Second assumption, wage setting. Here there is a frictional labor market with random search, and there is a representative firm that is posting wages. Notice that because the firm is representative, there can only be one wage in equilibrium. But so if there is one wage in equilibrium, that cannot be a wage motive to search on the job. So when people search on a job and get an offer, why they even switch? Well, they switch because they have exogenous preference shocks that makes them switch. So the turnover reallocation process in this model is separated from wages. Wages don't matter in this. So what is the trade-off for the firm that is posting this wage? Well, the firm trades off the higher cost of its wage against the benefit that its workers will be less likely to quit. So in this model, if the quit probability changes, then the equilibrium wage will also change. With this in mind, let's think about this cost of living shock. Remember the question, will the cost of living shock trigger an increase in wages? For that to happen, we need quit to change. And what is it that can change the probability of quitting? Well, there are two possible ways. One is on the labor supply side. Workers could search more. Well, that's not going to happen because there is no endogenous wage motive to search, and that's why on-the-job search here is exogenous. So if it is exogenous, it won't change. So the only way that actually quit can change is through labor demand. So the idea is that if vacancies increase, labor demand increases, and for a certain on-the-job search intensity, people will quit more. So here it's only through labor demand that quit can change and therefore wages. So this is also not going to happen in equilibrium, because if after the cost of living shock, the central banks looks through the permanent rise in the price level, aggregate demand remains unchanged, so labor demand is unchanged, so quits won't change, so wages can change. So the only thing that adjusts on impact of the shock is the real wage, and the cost of living shock, as you've seen, has no propagation whatsoever. Now, I want to draw your attention on three possible stories that are sometimes heard in the policy and academic debate on how wage price spirals can actually occur. The first one is just a bargaining story. Workers, whether they search on the job or not, they may demand compensation for their cost of living to their own employer. This is a story that seems to call for some sort of Nash bargaining or surplus sharing, and that's ruled out by construction. That's not in this model. Second story, it's one of outside offers. It may be that workers just search for other jobs and higher paying wages, and then they get back to their own employer and they say, you know, I got this, you may counter offer if you want, otherwise I leave. And this is a story that calls for sequential auction bargaining. That's not in the model, so also ruled out by construction. Now, there is a third story you can think of, which is one where here it is the employers that are worried their workforce may leave because they want to find higher wages. And so preemptively, they raise the wages so that workers don't quit. And this is the story that this paper is speaking to. Only that if you think about it, the prerequisite in this story is that workers may search for higher paying wages, and that's what the employer is worried against. So perhaps this is an element that is missing. But before I come back to this, I would like to give you some perspective on these three stories, making use of some work that I have ongoing with Darouguier, Melosi, and Villa. And here we put forward a job ladder model where on-the-job search is endogenous, and we have sequential auction bargaining. So in these models, the unemployed workers, they get a first job, and they get paid very little. They get squeezed to their absence of bargaining power. But then they can search for other jobs, they can get outside offers, and they can get back to their own employer and see whether the employer counter offers and then take a decision. So this is a model where what we are testing here is whether these sorts of behavior of the employed can generate wage inflation. And in order to test this mechanism, we make use of a Danish tax reform and look into the microdata there. So notice this is a tax shock that we are going to talk about that affects workers heterogeneously across the income distribution, but one could use this model and generate the same change in incentive to search on the job across the income distribution, which with a cost of living shock that is heterogeneous. So the model can speak to that. So this is the tax system in Denmark. In 2012, people with less than 4,600 euros, they would face a 42% marginal tax rate. Above that, the tax rate was 55%. So 13 percentage point increase. Now, the year after 2013, the threshold was moved 8 percentage points to the right. So what happens? That people at the 2012 threshold suddenly they find a fall of 13 percentage points in the marginal tax rate they are faced with. Workers that are far to the left or far to the right to this distribution are unaffected by this reform because for any plausible wage increase that they get searching on a job, they would still face the same marginal tax rate. So the differential effect of this reform is zero to the left and to the right. It peaks at the 2012 threshold, join the dots, and you get an inverse V-shaped response. To the extent that some people that search on the job manage to get their wages renegotiated upwards with their own employer, then wage growth for the stayers should also follow the same pattern. And this is exactly what we find in the data. This is on the job search. In red, it's the model. In blue, it's the data. We find this inverse V-shaped pattern. And if we look at wage growth for the stayers, these are people who do not change job, we find the same pattern. Interestingly, we do not find the same pattern, a differential pattern, for workers who change jobs, the leavers. Okay? Notice that people who change job, they still get an increasing wage on average. It's just that there is no differential impact in wage growth between the 2 years. Okay? And that's also in line with the model. So what does this evidence imply for the 3 stories I was speaking about, the third of which is the one that Jake has in his paper today? So what we show in the paper is that actually the first story that is based on Nash bargaining does not hold true, because if that was the case, we would find a V-shaped, while the data are inverse V. The inverse V is consistent with the second story of how wage growth could originate, which is one of outside offers. Workers search for jobs and then have them matched at their incumbent employers. But it also rejects actually the third story, the one that Jake has been telling about, the one of preemptive wage rises. Because in wage posting models, the wage that is posted applies to the leavers and to the stayers. It's one wage that is posted, so it cannot explain the differential behavior that we find in the data. So I would tend to agree with the conclusion that Jake makes today, which is that it is unlikely that the wage price spiral can be initiated by the employers raising wages. But that doesn't mean that in the absence of unions, there are no ways in which workers can exert bargaining power. One way is that actually look for other job offers, and maybe they get there renegotiated. So, I think perhaps that if there's one thing missing in the model is this wage distribution that makes meaningful for workers to search and for that preemptive mechanism to take place. The way I would have gone about it is to have directed search, because that would make probably the model have a fair chance to test this mechanism. And that's with that I conclude. But it was really a nice paper to discuss. Thank you.
Okay, we can now open the floor to questions. Maybe we can get started with the discussion, and if you wanted to respond, and then.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. It was a great discussion. I wrote down a lot because I think there's a lot to respond to. So first, I guess, we should definitely acknowledge the fact that wage posting is definitely not universal. Certainly, I think it's much more conventional in the labor, search and macro labor literature to assume like a job ladder model where there's bargaining and things like that. This is sort of kind of a marriage, if you will, between like assumptions that people make in the monopsony literature with assumptions that people make in the search literature and bringing that into a macro framework. So I think first 2 things to note. One is that like 10% of U.S. workers are unionized, and we're here, and at the ECB, and that's certainly that fraction may be higher in European countries, and that's absolutely something that if you're trying to write down a much larger quantitative model, you might want to capture. And certainly, at least in the time series for U.S. data, you can see that union wages absolutely like respond to inflation with a lag. Like that time series looks very different, and so they're 10%. That's non-trivial, right? So that's the first thing just to acknowledge right off the bat. And the second thing is that wage posting is definitely not universal. Certainly, all the people in this room, when I was on the job market a few years ago, I negotiated, I had multiple offers, right? Like that's not necessarily a great description of our labor market. So I think it absolutely maybe would improve the paper to discuss a little bit more what would happen if workers were bargaining, given that that's such a common assumption in the labor literature and also a realistic assumption of many labor markets. Why I think bargaining in particular is not necessarily going to overturn the results. Again, I think we're really interested in this story, and a lot of our modeling assumptions reflect the fact that we're trying to kill this idea that workers like magically get to claim a higher wage when the price level goes up. It just doesn't necessarily follow from. If you're not union wage setting from wage posting, it's not clear to me that it follows from bargaining, right? So certainly in a bargaining model, look, I'm about to have a kid, right? Very excited about that. But diapers cost a lot of money. My personal consumption bundle is about to get a lot more expensive. Is my bargaining position with my employer about to improve? Like, absolutely not. I mean, like, it's just I'm not going to get a higher wage because I'm suddenly spending more on diapers. And that's the sort of like shock that we have in the model. Now, of course, if the New York Fed, I mean, was somehow hit with a demand shock, right? And the surplus suddenly increased in a bargaining model, yes, I would be able to claim more surplus. But that's a very different kind of shock. That's a demand shock. The model we have would also say that my wages would go up in response to that sort of shock. It's just not happening through bargaining. It's happening because there's more competition across firms for my labor. Right. So it's not just a bargaining alone in response to this specific shock. It's not going to change that part of the story, which is why we were originally comfortable abstracting from that. Which again, like sometimes we like to talk about inflation as if the source doesn't matter, but of course it does in a general equilibrium setting, right? Like it's very easy to show in this model that inflation given by demand shocks is going to cause wages to rise, and by supply shocks, if it's caused by supply shocks, more conventional shocks like TFP shocks, right? You're going to get a different response, right? We all know that. Uh, so great. So the goal was sort of kind of fill that story. I do think you make a really good point that directed search, might be a way of making like the fact that there's no wage motive in equilibrium for workers to search is certainly unaesthetic. Doesn't really line up so much with the way we normally think about search. That might be a directed search model with maybe multiple markets where, even if you don't relax the wage posting assumption, would probably make the model more aesthetic. I think this could be one of the instances where maybe adding a little bit of complexity or richness actually makes the model easier to understand. So I think that was a suggestion we're definitely going to discuss, I think, with my co-authors after this. But yeah, it's not immediately clear to me that just having multiple wages and an incentive to search would overturn the results about the pass-through from a cost of living shock to wages. Because again, I think that the core idea, one of the motivations for this paper is it's not just a tractable model with on-the-job search where, okay, maybe we're going to upset some people because simplifying assumptions are a little strong. It's really to kind of kill this idea that like just because, I have to spend more on diapers, I'm going to get a higher wage from my employer. I guess one thing to add is that what can I do? I can search harder. So this also reflects your discussion. And that is something that I didn't have time to go over, but that's absolutely an extension that we think was very important to work through in the appendix. So, calibrated to some of Ina's work, we basically write down a version of the model where that lambda EE goes up when the price level rises. The thing that I think people that caught us by surprise is that the amplification you get in this model from that channel is low because, okay, from the firm's perspective, right, and partial equilibrium, oh, my workers are searching more, they're more likely to leave. The problem is that, well, they're also easy to replace because everyone else is searching more too. And workers in this model are substitutes, right? So maybe in markets where workers are not perfect substitutes and you do have some, maybe by searching, I can generate, more outside offers and kind of maybe bid the wage up that way, you could get a different result. But certainly in this market, just endogenizing kind of on the job search and like letting people search harder doesn't immediately overturn the results. Although in the interest of time, I'll direct anyone to our appendix if they're interested in the details. I guess I don't know if there's anything else that maybe I mentioned. Again, we'll talk more about this offline, but yeah.
Right. Do we have any questions from the audience? I have a question. So I was wondering whether the assumption that you're making that households are myopic, and I know that you mentioned that you have a richer version of the household side developed in the appendix. But if you were to live in a world with trend inflation, I would think that would change things quite a bit.
Yeah, so I haven't thought about how you're right. We linearize the model around a steady state with zero inflation, just because it's that's conventional. But you're right, we could absolutely consider trend inflation. So I will say that, the main thing that happens in the model is, basically the way we solve it is just basically assuming that you can take a perfect foresight solution, assume the firms are forward-looking, and they have to commit to a wage path in response to shocks. And then the wage setting decision doesn't just depend on the current wage because households are forward-looking. It depends on the whole path of wages. So I think it's a well-known problem in that setting that you have to take a stance on how to handle the firm's problem with commitment. And then, of course, okay, so now you've relaxed the myopia assumption, but now you have to make a different set of assumptions about how you want to handle that commitment problem. So because I come from the monetary DSG literature, I just use the timeless solution. which is easy to implement and difficult to talk about, which is why it's not the main example in the paper. But yeah, it basically like you're just changing like the derivatives with respect to the current wage. The derivatives, are with respect to the whole path of wages. So the economics doesn't seem to change too much. Again, those derivatives are still not going to be affected by the level of the of prices, right? But yeah, we haven't thought about how changes in trend inflation.
I guess another option would be to think about a shock to the cost of living that is extremely persistent. Maybe
Right.
another way to think about.
Yeah, I guess this is a great way to add one caveat to all this because people have different visions of what a wage price spiral is. I mean, long-term inflation expectations are perfectly anchored, right, in this model because we always assume you return to steady state. And yes, certainly, maybe with more persistent shocks that, like certainly, or permanent shocks, even we might get different results.
Thank you. Okay, if there are no more questions, there's a question.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a great, super interesting paper. I understand this isn't like the focus of your paper, but so you've said that demand shocks, those do affect. Wait, I guess I'm just wondering if the wage setting mechanism in your model, does that also amplify the inflationary effect of demand shocks in some way, or not? I wonder if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I don't think it amplifies the effect. I mean, certainly, it's something. I mean, the focus of the paper is not on demand shocks. You're right, and that's something that. So to be honest, we haven't looked into the quantitative aspects beyond just. I think we have one figure I didn't have time to show that just points out that yes, you can't. We make this claim. Oh, here's the wage Phillips curve. You can get a correlation between quits and wage inflation and pricing, and we check that, right? But it's a very qualitative exercise. I don't think it quantitatively looks too crazy if I just try to think about what the numbers look like in my head. Yeah, I will say, it's most of the validation we have is qualitative because we just really focus on the pass through, but that's something we could definitely look into more, I think.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. Let's give a round of applause to all of our speakers.